Welcome to Accelerate Science Now, where we sit down with innovators shaping policy, research, and industry to ask one big question: how do we make science move faster and work better for everyone? In this episode, we're joined by Dr. Tom Mitchell, a pioneer in artificial intelligence and machine learning, to explore how AI is reshaping the scientific process itself. Tom shares how new tools can help scientists read and synthesize entire fields of research, connect data across labs, and even automate experiments, accelerating discovery in ways once unimaginable. We also discuss what it means to train a new generation fluent in both science and AI, and how this convergence could spark a modern scientific renaissance. Enjoy the show. Today's guest is Dr. Tom Mitchell, Founders University Professor in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University and one of the world's leading voices in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Tom Mitchell founded CMU's Machine Learning Department, the first of its kind in the world, and is the author of the foundational textbook Machine Learning. Over his career, his research has spanned teaching machines to read the web in a never-ending learning loop, decoding brain activity during language comprehension, and exploring how AI can reshape education, work, and society. When Tom's not pushing the frontier of machine learning, he's thinking hard about how AI can responsibly advance health, learning, and human welfare. We're thrilled to have Tom with us today to talk about where AI is heading and how it can steer its impact toward accelerating science, equity, and insight. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Great. Well, we always like to start out learning a bit about your background. So I'd love to ask if there's something specific early on in your life that sparked your interest in science and made you want to pursue a career in science and technology.
There was. I was always very interested in intelligence, and I would notice things about my body that I didn't understand. Like once I knocked a glass off a table, and my arm shot down and caught the glass before it hit the ground. And I had no idea why it had done that because the whole thing happened so fast. I had no time to actually think, I thought. Um, and so I was just puzzled by many of those things. So I thought for a while about majoring in psychology so that I could study intelligence. But when I realized they didn't even have an oscilloscope, this was before the age of brain imaging. I decided I would instead just go to AI. So,
Wow. Oh, and at what point was that you made that decision in your career?
well, that was, I rejected psychology as soon as I find out there were no instruments to look inside the head. That was as an undergraduate, but it wasn't until PhD that I switched into working on AI.
Oh, got it. Okay, but still really, very early on, clearly been a pioneer in AI for a very long time. Was there something that first drew you to the idea that machines could learn in ways that resembles human learning?
Well, it always, if you think about intelligence for a while, then it seemed to me pretty obvious that the most puzzling and interesting part of intelligence was how we learn. I mean, once we know that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and other things, I could imagine, okay, we can put these facts together. But how we actually get those facts or acquire or generalize from examples that we see seem like the most interesting part of intelligence to me. And so that's how I got into the field and mostly what I've been looking at for many years.
And some of the things that are unlearned, I suppose, as well. Like, did you ever figure out the science behind human reflexes and reaching for that glass?
Not really, but I do know at this point something I didn't know before, which is that, um, if you put your hand on the stove and it's hot, your hand actually has a reaction that doesn't require that the signal travel all the way up to your brain and then back down to your hand. You actually have things built into your body that will make your arm react before the signal even has time to reach your brain. So there are things going on there, but no, I never figured out the glass thing. Still puzzled.
Well, yeah, you can keep working on it. Great. Well, I know that a lot of your work, I mean, you mentioned in your bio, has also been on, maybe not exactly mapping the brain, but, decoding brain activity. Can you talk about some of the work that you've done there and how AI has helped?
Yeah. So even though I rejected psychology when I was an undergraduate, around the mid 1990s, the technology of fMRI brain imaging became available. It really wasn't available before 1990. Um, and so I got interested in the question of what could we see? Now, finally, we had an oscilloscope to
Go
look
back to
at.
school.
Um, and so I found a colleague here at the university, Marcel Just, a psychology professor, who also happened to be the leading person on campus who had first obtained an fMRI scanner, access to one, and was doing some pretty interesting experiments. So I hung out with him and we came up with a question of could we train a machine learning system by giving it examples of here's a brain image, and this was captured when a person was reading the word tomato. And here's a different brain image where they were reading the word skyscraper. And could we train a system on those kinds of examples and get it to eventually learn to look at a new brain image and tell us whether the person was reading skyscraper or tomato? It turned out to work. We found out a way to do that. And then it got interesting because you can then think of that um, technique of training using machine learning, a classifier of brain images according to the word stimulus somebody's reading. You can think of that as a kind of virtual sensor of the
Mhm.
information content in your neural signal. That's what fMRI is, recording three-dimensional neural activity in the brain. And so once you get that idea, you can use it to ask very interesting questions like, is this neural code for tomato and skyscraper and all the other words
Mhm.
the same in your head and my head, or is it different? And we could turn that into a machine learning question, which is, could I train my classifier on data from my brain, but then use it to decode data from your brain successfully?
And can you?
The answer is yes. It's amazing. Um, it turns out if we do that, I can decode from your brain. If I give, say, two word choice to the classifier, is she reading word A or word B? Uh, chair or automobile. It will be right on your brain, even though it never trained on it, over 90% of the time.
Wow, that and I'm guessing I think my first question that came up was, well, some people, may have a lot of emotion attached to a certain word or something like that. Are those the instances in which maybe it doesn't recognize it for a certain person?
There are certainly individual differences. Um, the amazing thing, though, is though even though we're all different, we all had different upbringings and experiences. Um, the dominant thing when you think about, say, tomato, I can tell you that it activates the same general regions as in my brain, which are, for one, the part premotor cortex, the part of your brain that has to do with grasping, like you would grasp a tomato. It also activates gustatory cortex, the part of your brain that's associated with the sense of taste. And so what we discovered is um, the neural code for the meaning of these different words is really grounded in sensory and motor regions of the brain that are associated with how you would perceive and what you would do with these different objects. And since your gustatory cortex is roughly speaking in the same part of your brain as mine, that's enough to make it possible for us to have such similar neural codes.
Wow. So, I mean, aside from being just absolutely fascinating that that's possible, what are the possible like health impacts or medicinal impacts of a machine learning code like this?
Well, people have used it for a number of things. One very hot topic right now is, to what degree can we use these kinds of trained AI models to decode the thoughts of people who are locked in, that is, people who can't speak or for one reason or another are unable to speak, or even people who are in a coma. There's always been a question, if somebody's in a coma, do they still perceive in some sense what is being said in the room? Or if what did they hear the sounds? And so there are interesting clinical applications around this kind of extreme cases. Or mundane cases, there are plenty of people with various kinds of language problems, dyslexia, and so forth. And so there's some hope, some optimism that we'll be able to develop a more accurate and detailed understanding of language processing in the human brain, which will then allow us to do a better job of diagnosing and hopefully giving the right therapy for people with different kinds of language disorders.
Yeah, it seems like it could have really incredibly far-reaching impacts in so many different areas. That's amazing. Looking back, were there moments in your research, and maybe happening all the time, that really changed your view of what AI is capable of and maybe what it isn't?
I think there, in my career, which by the way started in the 1970s, so a long time ago, um, I think machine learning has gone through a couple important paradigm shifts. But I mean, two of the most important were around the 1990s. Um, the field of machine learning, which really was mostly an outgrowth of computer science and artificial intelligence, um, got seriously blended with the field of statistics and probability. And that was a huge positive event for the field because, statisticians, I can't believe it took us till the 1990s to kind of pick up on this. But obviously, statisticians had been thinking about what can you learn from various data sets and
Right.
what kind of assumptions you have to make in order to do that. And so that was one really important step. The other one, which is huge, is the 2022 release of ChatGPT
Mm.
and the uh, advances that went into making that possible. And what really was going on there was the use of machine learning methods, um, variants of machine learning methods for training neural networks, different kinds of neural networks. People had been experimenting with training, just like we were able to train a system that would take as input a brain image and predict which word you had been reading. People were trying to build systems that would take a string of words in and predict the next word.
Hmm.
It turned out, to most people's great surprise, that if you did this on a huge data set, for example, scrape the web and look at every word sequence on the web, then you end up with a system that can not only predict the next word, but as a byproduct of that training, ends up with a very rich, learned internal description of what that input word sequence must have meant. And if you want to think about this, think about, say, reading a mystery novel, and you get to the end of the mystery novel and the sentence says, and the killer was. Now, if you have to predict that next word based on the whole string of words you've read in the novel up to that point, you can see that if you could successfully predict that next word, it would be evidence that you had developed a very sophisticated and complete description of the earlier part of the novel up to that point. And so the same thing is happening um, at web scale in training these large language models. I mean, it has been a revolution to the field of AI, obviously.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, AI obviously has so many really exciting applications. I definitely love to focus in on, the science behind, or I guess not behind it all, but how AI can help science. One thing that you've said is that AI can really help close the loop of science. So, automating not just data analysis, but hypothesis generation and experiment design. Could you talk about what that might look like in practice?
Sure. There are a number of areas of science where AI has already made big differences. For example, I'm sure you're aware of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry that was just awarded to the people who developed and the people who used an AI system called AlphaFold. That's a program that was trained. Again, there was the input-output training examples. The input in this case was the chemical formula of a protein, a particular kind of molecule. And the output was the three-dimensional structure of that protein in the real world. And it turns out predicting those three-dimensional structures is a key part of trying to design, for example, drugs that will interfere with certain kinds of infections, and key part of understanding biological processes in general. So there's an example of a very important Nobel-worthy use of AI for science. I could give you other examples in weather forecasting, which has improved dramatically in the last 2 years. I could give you examples of materials science, learning to predict the physical properties of materials before you actually go to the trouble of building them and measuring them. But in general, when I look at the sciences and what the real opportunities are, there are kind of three broad categories to me. One is, uh, here's the way to say it. In many cases, science today works kind of like science worked 100 years ago. I think of it as Lone Ranger science. So in a Lone Ranger science, you're an individual investigator. You might have a team of half a dozen students. Um, you come up with an idea. You might run an experiment. Maybe you're a neuroscientist and you run a brain imaging experiment. You and your half dozen students look at that data. You analyze it. You write up your analysis of that data. You publish it in a journal article. And then you close the book and start over. Lone Ranger in the sense that you're working as part of this large community, but you're not really working connected to that community. And there are a couple of problems there. One is um, you can't, when you're doing that data analysis, that if you could only get all the data that the other neuroscientists had and simultaneously analyze their data and yours, then you'd have a much more interesting and correct result than if you only look exclusively at your own data and ignore all that other stuff that's going on in the field. So one way that AI is helping is by being used to integrate data from many laboratories, many experiments, to simultaneously analyze those. And that's what was actually behind the development of that AlphaFold program I mentioned that learns how proteins fold. That was based on experimental data collected from many labs. So that's one direction. Another direction is, again, as an individual scientist, if there are thousands of papers published each year in your field, and let's say you read one a day, you've read 365, you haven't even
And you
scrape.
spent a whole year doing it. Yeah.
It's impossible to keep up. But the cool thing is, I believe this decade, in the next 5 years, we're going to have AI language model based systems that literally read all of the scientific papers in your field for you. And when you are thinking about a new experiment or a new hypothesis, you will interact with that language model and it will tell you which of the thousands of papers are most relevant to the thing you're thinking about right now. Will tell you what you should read. And furthermore, it'll give you the summary of the ideas in those papers. So that's a huge thing. The
Yeah.
third thing is automated experiments. Um, many certain types of science, for example, small chemistry experiments, are already being conducted uh, in some cases by robots who can move around the syringes of chemicals and mix them. And so that's a third area. When you put that all together, access to the literature, automating the experiment execution, analyzing the data from many experiments in a single integrated model. It's a huge potential accelerator of many fields of science.
Yeah. And so I guess so exciting. One question that comes up for me, and I'm just like thinking back to, granted, it was policy oriented, not scientific, but when I was writing my thesis and like looking at all the different papers, I didn't have AI to tell me which ones were the good ones. I think there were naturally some that I was maybe somewhat skeptical of, or some that I found really interesting. Is there a way to train the AI models to have those thoughts themselves, or where are we, how do we make sure that we're keeping human like intuition and skepticism still in the mix with science?
That's a great point, and I don't think we're there yet. Um, so I've been doing a little experiment of my own on my 15-minute commute into Carnegie Mellon from my apartment, which is I'll have 15-minute conversations each morning as I'm driving in with ChatGPT or Gemini. I put them on the car radio and talk as I'm driving. And now that I've been doing this for several months, I've had the time to test out different opportunities to use the system. And in my take is if I try to get it to brainstorm with me about a new research idea, to be honest, I'm often disappointed
Hmm.
because it's not as good as my PhD students are,
That's good to hear.
which is a good thing, I guess. Um, in terms of creativity, it's not there. But what it's amazingly good at is, again, already it's good at telling me about related work that's been done
Hmm.
that I should really know about if I'm going to push in this direction in my research. And at the end of the drive, it'll give me a transcript, and I ask it to just give me a list of all the references that came up during our conversation. So there are ways in which it's very helpful. And in those conversations, to get back to your point, I am able to direct it um, through the conversation into the kinds of subproblems I'm interested in. But so my take at the moment, the state of the art, it's better than I am at finding related work and helping me understand what I should read. It's nowhere close to the scientists who I interact with in terms of creativity.
Well, I think that's kind of the fun part of it all anyway. So it's nice that we can keep that for ourselves. Something that, keeps coming up is, finding all the references, knowing what's already been done. How do we make sure that, the models that you're using have access to like all the best data that's out there?
That's in part a cultural issue and in part a policy issue. Um, Different fields have very different cultures for sharing data. For example, machine learning one reason it was able to make progress at the fast rate that it has is that very early on, it adopted the culture that if you publish a paper where you trained your system on some data, you should also publish that data so that other people can try their own learning algorithm on your data and see if it worked better or worse than
Mhm.
theirs. Um, some fields, like neuroscience, have just the opposite culture. Actually, biological sciences, um, in general, tend to have a culture that says, my data is mine and I don't share it. And there are exceptions to that. Human Genome Project is a good example. Um, but historically, I think because of medicine, the medical sciences, and the need to keep personal medical data private,
Right.
um, certain fields really have a culture of protecting data rather than sharing it. And I think that here's the way to put it. In order to really take advantage of the potential of the capabilities of these language models to read and digest all these papers, we have to make the papers available. NIH, which is the major funder for biological sciences, now requires that if you're funded by NIH, you put your papers on a website called PubMed. But at this time, PubMed only requires that the abstract of the paper be there,
Oh, well, that's not
not
super
necessarily the
helpful.
full paper, and not necessarily the data set that you use in the
Mhm.
experiments you're reporting. So it's partly cultural and partly policy. NIH could change their policy to make those data sets available more widely. Also, I think the good news is I see the cultures changing in many fields uh,
Mhm.
toward more community-based sharing of data.
Yeah, moving away from that Lone Ranger science that you mentioned earlier. Could you talk a little bit about the Human Genome Project and what that was and how it maybe contributed to changing the culture a little?
The Human Genome Project, I was not part of this, so I don't know the full details, but um, broadly speaking, was an effort to uh, collect to map out the human DNA
Mhm.
and to understand what's common among us and which parts of that DNA differ. And at this point, there's a pretty good map of the human genome and a growing understanding of which parts of that DNA have influence on what parts of our phenotype, on what parts of our body. For example, which parts of DNA might be responsible for being susceptible to certain diseases. Um, Very interesting studies also about evolution, about what is the relationship between our DNA, the DNA of gorillas and orangutans and monkeys and dogs and ants and butterflies. And so, pretty amazing thing. But it was an early example of a carefully planned and well-funded effort to create data for the community. There have also been some failures. In the early 2000s, the National Science Foundation in the US decided to fund an effort to collect brain image data. Dartmouth University was funded to do this. They did a great job. They made a web-based portal where you could go and contribute data and access data that was there. In the end, it didn't work. In the end, it didn't have the kind of transformative impact on the field that you would have hoped. And my assessment of that, and I've talked to other people about this, I think the shared view on this, consensus view, is the reason it failed was that it wasn't for the human genome. it was easy to document what you had done.
Right.
Collected this data this way, you could repeat that experiment in your own lab. But for a brain imaging study, where you put people in a scanner and then you show them arbitrary stimuli, could
Hmm.
be images of different kinds, could be stories, could be sounds. Um, and in the early 2000s, we did not have computers that were able to make sense of text or images or sounds. And so there was really no way to index that or to document it at a level where it could be repeated. So the good news is now in 2025, I think we're in much better shape in terms of having computers that can help us index that stuff, um, interpret it, pull out the relevant stuff for our question. So I think even in the field of neuroscience, it's worth a revisit to that question, but in many fields too.
Yeah, definitely. Is that data still out there, or were just the images scanned and it missed any of the indexing of like what was being shown to the patients?
I think the data is still out there. In
Mhm.
fact, if you go to my website, you can just download some data that we've collected along with the stimuli. But what's not there is the computer program that we used to automate the stimulus presentation to the person. And that computer program had details of the experiment, like exactly how many milliseconds did the image remain on the screen, exactly how much time was there between the presentation of one word and the next word. How did that timing synchronize with the scan cycle of the fMRI machine, which takes roughly one image per second? So what was the word presented when the scan was starting or when the scan
Mm.
was ending? So those kind of detailed timing, which sound like little details, are actually really important details if you want to have the opportunity to repeat that experiment or make a small change to it. And that kind of information was simply not recorded, not documented, not shared in most cases. So the data's there, but its usefulness is hampered by that. Here's one key point.
Mhm.
To the degree that we can now get computers to automate the execution of experiments, the computer programs that execute those become the documentation for the experiment. So just like we have a website called GitHub, where many people upload their software so that other people can share it,
Mhm.
we should, and I think we will eventually have a similar GitLab. I don't know what you call it, but a GitHub for laboratory experiments, where people upload literally the software to regenerate their experiment, and people can download it, and they won't have to go through text documentation and pull out the details. They'll just be able to use the code to re-execute and edit the code if they want to make a small change.
But be able to, yeah, essentially run the same experiment, see the different results. That makes a ton of sense. And it actually, I sort of lends into the question I was going to ask next, which is like clearly there needs to be not essentially regulations, but if the government is going to, say, okay, also publish your results, or we're calling for this, there have to be like specifications for it to be useful. Is that something that like who should be helping with it? Is it that there's just like code that everyone should be using, or are there scientists who should be, helping write these grants or these policies?
It seems to me that there's so many different details in different fields. So think about weather forecasting, materials science, and cell biology. Those are three areas where already AI is making an impact and being adopted in different ways. But the key thing there is it's different ways. So, for example, in cell biology, this Nobel Prize winning program that predicts how proteins fold turned out to be very important. Well, that's so different from what you would need if you're working on weather forecasting or material. It's certainly weather forecasting. Um, so I think what we really need is both um, an attempt to uh, policies that will encourage, incentivize the freeing up and sharing of data to a greater degree, including websites where we can store them and also store the experimental procedures. But if I were king, uh, 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 the first thing I would do, honestly, uh, is in parallel, maybe start those efforts. But then in parallel with that, I would challenge each field, material science, agriculture, every field,
Mhm.
to to get it to to get together people in that field and write a short white paper which has the distilled set of ideas of what that field thinks AI could do for it. Because the idea of let's figure out how the three-dimensional structure of proteins, that would never come from me working in cognitive neuroscience. I never would have thought of that. It's really the scientists in these different fields who know what they need, who know what the key questions are. And those people working in conjunction with computer scientists, AI scientists, um, each field could hold its own, for example, workshop, and come up with uh, one or more than one white papers about saying very bottom up what we think the real opportunity is in our field. And I think that's the way it's going to play out, because even though there are these general themes like move from Lone Ranger to community data, move from not being able to read the literature to having an AI system read it for you, those are kind of general cross science themes. But the details for each science really are quite different. And we need the scientists in those fields to bring their creativity forward and suggest. They don't even have to be right in the end. They just need to suggest what are some of the opportunities that we ought to pursue and see which ones we can deliver on.
Oh, that's so exciting to even just think about, like, seeing all of those out and seeing all the white papers. Do you know if anyone's, like, working on trying to get that to happen?
I have not seen an effort to fund that kind of activity, and it's time.
Yeah. Oh.
Some groups are stepping forward and doing it themselves. For example, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, a philanthropic organization, has decided they're going to focus on cell biology, and they've pulled together a number of people in the community, and they're funding a number of efforts centered around the idea of integrating experimental data of many different types about how single cells work. And they even call it the virtual cell project. So there are efforts in different fields. But what I think the big, uh, and it's not even expensive, the low cost big opportunity here is to really challenge every single field to do some brainstorming and come up with these white papers that characterize what are potential wins, and then we can go forward from there.
And speaking of low cost opportunities, you wrote something interesting in your AI for Science white paper that I hadn't heard before, which is that the computational needs for AI science efforts can be much, much smaller than what's needed for something to train a large language model like ChatGPT. Can you explain that a bit on why that's the case and why that's important?
Yeah, it turns out the computational costs for these large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, and so forth are extremely large, bigger than anything we've ever seen. Um, why? Because they're training on the web, and the web is huge. That's their data set. So they need very large computers, very large computation to train on that particular kind of data. Um, and they also need, if they have billions of users, they also need the computers after they've trained to execute the model and let you use it. But if you think about, for example, the Nobel Prize winning system that learned how proteins fold, that's very different. They weren't training on a trillion words from the web. They were training on, I think the number was thousands, but certainly not millions of examples of here's a chemical formula and here's the 3D structure. I spoke with the people who developed that system and I asked them, how much computation did it take? And they said, well, it wasn't trivial, but it was under 10 million. $10 million. Now, if you compare that with the hundreds of billions of dollars being raised and being required actually to develop the next generation large language model, we're talking about many orders of magnitude less expense. And so it's, again, it gets down to, every science has its own kind of needs and its own kind of data. But machine learning has been proceeding for a couple decades now, doing useful things with data sets that are much smaller than the web. And I think in many of these scientific applications, it'll continue to be that way. In others, it won't. For example, one area, climate modeling, and is an area where the amount of data is truly extraordinary when you add up all the data from global satellites that are getting images everywhere on Earth every 90 minutes, and combine that with the other kind of data we have here on the ground of water levels and rivers and weather reports and everything. There are huge amounts of data there too. So it's not like everything will be cheap, but there are many opportunities where the actual cost is very affordable compared to even current um, research budgets out of government funding.
Right. Yeah. I mean, 10 million, yeah, obviously not nothing, but really exciting to think about the kind of impact that you can have with, for a lot of government spending, somewhat low dollar amount. Yeah, I wanted to make sure, as a professor, that we got to some of the AI and education research that you've done. So, with how much, science is changing with AI and that, machine learning can help with basically every stage of the scientific process now, how does that change how you're educating future scientists?
The future of many sciences is going to be accelerated by developing and innovating and using new AI tools. Um, that's not to say there won't be other things that also cause scientific advance, but I think um, the single most important thing that's going to happen over the next decade, if you average across all sciences, is this collision of AI with many, many different sciences. And so if you take that as an assumption, then it's pretty clear that what we want to do is we want to train a new generation of people, of researchers, of scientists who are skilled both in the sense that they understand their science, biology, chemistry, materials, climate, whatever their science is, but they equally understand um, the AI tools and um, the basics of AI to the degree where they could then invent for themselves. Here's what we really need. Because I can't, for example, sit down and guess what chemists, how chemistry will be changed. I'm not a chemist. I don't know enough chemistry to make an informed guess about that. It has to be somebody who understands chemistry. But similarly, if they only understand chemistry and AI looks like magic to them, they won't be calibrated in terms of what's the opportunity here. So we really need, and the good news is, um, you know, in 5 or 6 years, we could graduate a whole new generation of PhDs and postdocs and researchers who are trained in this new cross-disciplinary way. And I know many universities, including here at CMU, are very much interested in offering programs that'll encourage that kind of training.
Right. And can be cross-disciplinary. And it's kind of cool to think about scientists in all these different areas having something in common.
Yeah. Yeah. If you look at just the advance of different fields over the last couple of centuries, people sometimes bemoan the fact that we're not all Renaissance people anymore. The notion of a Renaissance person is like Da Vinci. They kind of knew something about everything and they could integrate it all into uh, an integrated picture of how the world works. But now we seem to be getting more and more specialized with every generation. My guess is that AI is going to be a force to reverse that trend because it makes it much easier to learn or to get the facts that you need to know about a new field. It's already very good at tutoring me about fields that I don't know about. And so I think it'll be a force for pushing us back toward being more Renaissance people again.
Ah, wow, the next Renaissance. When you're driving to work and you're having those conversations, are they about all sorts of different topics, or are you siloed into what exactly you're working on?
This morning's conversation was actually about quantum physics and the wave particle duality. And I was trying to understand, I'm not a trained physicist, but I was curious. There's this phenomena that physicists talk about where things like light can have both properties of a wave, but also a particle. And then they believe that if you observe a photon, a unit of light, then it will become a particle as a side effect of you observing it. And so today's 15-minute discussion was around what do you mean by observe? And does it have to be a human? No, it could be a machine. Um, could it be an atom? Yes. If the wave, uh, if you put a photon through a diffraction slit and it spreads out into a wave that covers a large amount of space, what if you only observe a little bit of that space? Does that count? Well, it counts, but I couldn't tell any of this to you yesterday because I had a conversation with GPT. But it does count. But if you only measure part of the field of view where the wave covers, then it'll only either the particle will show up there, or if it doesn't, suddenly the wave function will readjust so that the wave function is zeroed out basically where you looked and didn't find it, but the rest remains a wave function. So there are all these little nuances about observability. Anyway, that was today's conversation.
Much more
Other-
advanced than my talks with my dog on our walk in the morning. I'll have to start bringing my
but
phone
I
along.
had other conversations where I was going to give a lecture and I just wanted to go through, see if it had any suggestions. One of my most surprisingly helpful conversations was when I was going to be visiting Spain and my Spanish is pretty broken.
Mhm.
And so I just said, hey, this morning on the drive, let's speak in second grade Spanish. And it turned out to be a wonderful tutor for learning a second language.
Wow, yeah, so fun, so many different uses. Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been incredibly enlightening. I really appreciate all the time and insights you've given.
It's a pleasure. Enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Well,
Thanks.
thank you. You've been listening to Accelerate Science Now. I'm your host, Adeline DeYoung. This show is produced by Kindred Subjects, Accelerate Science Now, and Seed AI. Our executive producers are Josh New and Austin Carson. Special thanks to Kevin King for editing and production. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.